Application Insights is a fantastic tool to help you understand what's happening in your application. Let's mash on that.
Hi everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Asp.Net Monsters. In today's episode, we're going to take a brief look at Application Insights. So what's Application Insights?
Well, Simon, we've worked together on some projects before, and you've kind of seen how excited I get about Application Insights.
Oh my goodness. Giddy like a schoolgirl.
It's absolutely true. Guilty. So Application Insights is kind of a bunch of things, I guess, but it's a product that sits within Azure Monitor. It's a product that would fit under the suite of application performance monitoring. So the idea is that there's different parts to it, but you can add some SDKs to your application, and it will kind of instrument your code and give you information about at runtime about what dependencies you're calling, like making HTTP calls to other services or making database calls to SQL Server, for example, and kind of consolidate that all into a central location where you can query it efficiently and get some overview to tell you exactly what's happening within your application. And you can look at specific transactions and see, or specific requests, and see everything that happened along as part of processing that request. And then there's a whole other set of stuff that sits on top of that with alerts and machine learning to detect potential performance anomalies or security anomalies or different things that might happen within your application. So what I wanted to show today is I have just this kind of goofy sample application that really makes not a lot of sense at all, but it gets data from a bunch of different places and displays it on a home screen.
Okay.
So it calls to some third-party HTTP REST API to get a list of users. It calls a database locally that has a bunch of tweets in it, and then it calls another service that I've built over a REST API to get a fake weather forecast. So just random stuff that it's getting, and that's the whole app. And what I'm going to do is just add App Insights to that, and then we're going to take a look at what we get just out of the box from App Insights just by adding it to our project.
Wow, surely adding Application Insights is super complicated.
It is extremely complicated. So to add App Insights, we right-click on the project, click Add, and then click Application Insights Telemetry. Then we hit Get Started. And you need to be logged in here to an Azure account. I'm already logged in. And you select your subscription. It can create a new resource for you, or in my case, I have an existing one that I'm going to tie into. I've already created it for this sample. And then I click Register. And it's going to go and add what it needs to add to this project for me. That might look a little scary, like it added a bunch of stuff to my app that I might not want, but let's just take a look at what it did add, because there's not a whole lot there. Down in App Settings, it added a setting here for an instrumentation key. So that's what points to the specific App Insights instance in Azure that I had configured. And the other thing it did was added a dependency here to Microsoft.applicationinsights.ASP.NET Core. Now, one of the things I like to do after adding is just check to see if there's any updates, and there is, because it seems like that process is always a step or two behind the current version of the package for App Insights. It's always good to just make sure you're up to date with that. And that's it. Now I can run my app.
So that's all it adds? It doesn't add anything to startup class or anything like that?
Oh, sorry. Yes, there is the startup class. Thank you for actually pointing that out. So it added under services here, it added Application Insights Telemetry. And that's going to go and add the pieces it needs to tie into .NET and get that information it needs about the different dependencies that you're going to be talking to, like your HTTP dependencies and SQL Server. So what it does under the covers is it ties into the diagnostics source for those different things like HTTP and SQL connection. And from that is able to grab the information it needs to push up to App Insights for you.
Cool.
So when we run this now, we're going to see a couple of things different. So the app's going to run just as it always did. I'll just refresh the page a couple times so that we get some data sent up there. But you'll notice I have an Application Insights button here with a number next to it that keeps increasing. And if I click on that, it's going to show me some information right in Visual Studio here about the telemetry that's being sent up. This view I don't usually find very useful. I like to go and look at this data up actually in Application Insights. So if we go over to the Azure Portal, so this is my Application Insights instance that I tied to. Might take a few minutes for things to start showing up here, but we do see that there's server requests coming in. So it looks like it does have some data. And one of the places I like to go here is just initially to take a look at things is the Performance tab. So under the Performance tab, we get to see a list of all the a summary of the operations that happened and the dependencies that were called. Again, there is a little bit of a delay here with those operations showing up.
There's a couple of minutes behind, but that's to be expected.
That might seem a little bit odd when we're just talking about like 4 requests, but when you're in a production environment and there's lots of data coming at this from different sources, that's a little more understandable that it's not going to be completely live. There is a place that you can go to see exactly the live metrics that are flowing through. So when I click on this, it should show me that there is one server, which is my local dev server.
Do you ever wonder what it's doing in those 8 seconds?
No.
It's funny that it always takes
I've wondered, but I have no idea. So if I go and refresh my page here, I should see that request come through right away. There's a request that came in, dependency calls. So that is live when we're looking at it there, but when we're looking at something like the Performance tab, there's a little bit of a delay.
There we go.
Now we have our data. So what I can do here is I see all the operations, and an operation in the context of .NET app in this case is like the request that's being processed. So the browser sent a request to / the root page, and I can see that it took on average 4.26 seconds for the 2 requests that it has in here. And I can actually drill into those and see samples of them, which is really cool. So I can say drill into those and show me, let's look at this one that took a couple seconds. And right away I can see that, okay, here's my call to the / page, the index page. And we can see, oh, I'm making a call to this API, the URL API/users. If I click on it and look at the right, I can actually see exactly the call that was made. So I made a get call to API/users, and the root URL for that is reqres.in. That's the API that I'm calling. There's the actual path that was called, how long it took. Lots of really great information there. So that was a 1.4 second call. And then when that finishes, I make a call to my local weather service, which takes 60 milliseconds, and same kind of data there. The interesting thing to see is that the type on this dependency is HTTP. So those were HTTP calls in both those cases. And then I have a bunch of database calls here, so that's kind of interesting. Something might be a little bit goofy there. We can see that there's a call to SQL, and we actually see the command that was made. So I'm calling select top however many items from tweets. And then if I look at what all these other ones are, we can see that it's making calls to get the users. So it looks like there's maybe an n+1 query problem there. So we'll go investigate that. But the other thing that's a little bit interesting to me here is that there's a bit of a waterfall pattern happening here with those 3 things that I'm calling. I call this API, and then I wait till it's done before I call the next API, and they're not really like related things. So it's I don't need any information from the first one before I call that second one, so maybe we can make some improvements there. So that's all just stuff that we got out of the box by just adding App Insights. Let's go take a look.
Even if that's all you got, this would be a very useful tool.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's take a look at my little manufactured example here and see if we can make some improvements to it. So if we look at the page, first I want to see what's going on with this, all those queries. And that's one of the things that I often end up seeing when I add this in a production environment is I'll look at a request or an operation here and see that there's a lot of dependencies listed. 51 is quite a few dependency calls to make to render a single page. So that's kind of a code smell or a pattern that I look for that's an area of potential improvement. So if we look at this, it's just doing tweet context.tweets, take 100 and to list async. And if we go look at where that's being rendered out, this beautiful UI I've built, it's just doing a tweet.user.username. So it looks like it's lazy loading user, and that's the problem. So for every tweet, it goes and gets the user from the database, which is costly and repetitive. So it looks like somebody turned on lazy loading, which is something we probably shouldn't do, but as a quick fix, what I can do is say include we'll include the user as part of that call. And then we should get down to just a single database call at least for this. Excellent. Let's have a look at, it still works, so that's a good first step. And let's just see what we see here if I try to view everything in Visual Studio. So here's my request. Here's the SQL GET call. And yes, you can see here. So I don't get that nice overview that tells me how many dependencies were there for that request, but I can kind of look at a high level here and see that there was my request, and then it looks like there were only 3 dependencies. So I can come in here and see that, yes, there was a call to SQL, and the command that was executed is actually joining to the users now. So it's just doing that single call to get all our data with a single database call instead of 50 of them or 100 of them or whatever it was. So that's the first improvement. The next one is that we don't really need to be waiting for the user call to finish before we make the call to the forecast APIs. So what we could do here, there's a couple different ways we could structure this, but what I'm going to do is say our user's task equals, I'm not going to wait it immediately. I'm just going to continue and make the call to the weather service. And then finally, make this call to my database. So there's a couple, these tasks still need to be awaited. It's important that we do that. But the key difference here is that we're not going to wait for that the user's call to finish before we make the next one. It's going to fire them all off right away. And one way that we can wait it is to say await task.whenAll, and then we just pass in all those tasks. And tweets task. And then we still need to assign the results to our properties on our page model. So then we're going to say users task result, weather task.result. And finally, the tweets task.result. Okay. So we'll run this, and it'll probably be a little bit hard to tell just from how long it takes to render the page, but it should render a lot faster now. And let's see if we can get some of that data over in App Insights, just to compare what the end-to-end transactions look like compared to how we started. There we go. Okay, so now let's filter that down to the last 30 minutes. And we should see, oh look, there's a decrease. So this is kind of a neat thing. You'll notice that, so initially here I had the whole 30 seconds selected. And if I go and kind of zoom that down to just the last few that were there, it actually tells me a delta, so how much faster did it get compared to the previous calls.
You also really improved that favicon.
I did, yeah.
I don't know how you did that, but good job.
Magic. Okay, so if we look at the most recent ones, which would be these ones. Okay, so you can see this no longer has that waterfall kind of pattern. These are happening more in parallel now. And it's nice that database call is super fast because we're doing it as a single call. This API call is slow because I specifically passed in a delay of 1 because I didn't want everything to happen too fast. And this one is actually a random delay between 150 and 300 milliseconds. So that's intentionally that slow. Okay, so a couple things before we wrap up this episode. The things that we're looking at in App Insights here, there's a little bit to know about where that data comes from. So all the data that we're looking at is actually in something called Log Analytics. So Application Insights, the SDK that we installed into our app, pushes what they call telemetry data over to Log Analytics, and then Application Insights is like the set of UIs and queries on top of that analyzes that data for us and exposes it in a way that is meaningful. But we can always go and you'll see this button all over the place in App Insights, where you can just open the data in Log Analytics and see the raw data. So what I wanted to point out here is that there's like these different types of telemetry. So there's things called requests, and the request is like the HTTP request that your server is processing. In our case, that's the call to the index page, and that's the thing that the timing is going to be like the total length of the request. And then the other thing that we were looking at today was dependencies. So we had dependencies that have different types. So the dependencies in our case were of type, they were HTTP and SQL, and we can kind of see details about that in here when we look at the raw data. Other interesting things are page views when you get into Application Insights in the browsers. There's some client-side aspects to it, kind of like a Google Analytics feel to it, where it tracks page views, but it all gets correlated with the data, with the processing of the data on the back end too, so you get to see it all in a nice consolidated view. There's also traces, so you can send like your log messages in as trace telemetry that you can also view in here, and we're going to look at that later. There's custom events, which I don't have a lot of experience with actually.
I use that sometimes for if there's like a series of dependency calls or things that I want to know what sort of timings there are on those. I might use a custom event for that.
Cool. And custom metrics, kind of similar concept there. If there's just something that you're tracking the timing on specifically, and performance counters would be, so part of what the SDK can do also is pass in data about like your CPU usage and memory usage in your app. So that's where performance counters would come in, and then browser timings for how long things are taken in the browser. So there's different types of telemetry and exceptions for errors. We've only touched today on dependencies and requests, which are kind of the main ones that you see out of the box and that help you really see what's happening with your app. Last thing I wanted to mention is that what you're typically going to want to do in a production environment or in like a real world scenario is have a different instrumentation key per environment. So you're going to want at least definitely a separate one for your production environment. So a completely separate App Insights instance, and it's with its own instrumentation key for production versus the developers and your local development and your test environments or whatever other environments you happen to have, because it gets really confusing if you start having that data all mixed together in a single instance.
Yeah, that's what I do too. And the way that App Insights is billed is it's billed by how much data you ingest and a few other little things. So you don't get billed for having multiple App Insight instances. So this is a good way to separate your data. It doesn't cost you anything more.
Yep. In fact, it will probably cost you less because you get the free 5 gigabytes per month per instance, right?
Is that per instance? I think that's per subscription.
Oh, okay.
I think Microsoft maybe saw our little trick coming and adapted to it.
My hundreds of App Insights instances
Yep.
that I thought I could get for free.
One for each day of the week.
Perfect. So that's all I had for today. We're going to, in future episodes, dig into a few more things with App Insights, but that's it for today.
Thanks everybody for watching. Make sure to like, comment, share our video. We are keeping metrics on it.
Absolutely.